I'm not endorsing them. I didn't say Azov was good. I'm just saying your classification of them is inaccurate. Also, my response isn't to come out here and just play defensive Azov. The only reason I'm doing this is because you tried to basically say, actually, Russia isn't the real fascist. This is ridiculous. In fact, it's hypocritical because in the Ukrainian military, there's a lot more fascism than in the Russian government. That was what I was objecting to.
And start the party. Today is Everything Ukraine. Welcome to the Minds of the Ecclesia panel. We're going to go ahead and start with introductions for everyone.
Hey, how's it going, Lee? Glad to be here. So for people who do not know me, I am Crowdsourced Politics, aka Cypher, aka Anthony, and I do a weekly news stream Thursdays, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to roughly 10 p.m. Standard Time, covering the news that only the crowd can provide. We also do other shows with Tiberius. He's been on several shows with us. We're going to be starting those back up next month once we can arrange what to talk about, and also do some essays. So yeah, you can find me on YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, wherever. Just look for Crowdsourced Politics.
Excellent. And we have Dylan, who was kind enough to come and share his insights and real-world understanding of the situation we're dealing with. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, I've been having a lot of internet trouble today. Can you hear me?
Muted.
Oh, muted. I'm
on Discord.
Yeah, I've been having a lot of internet trouble today, so if I drop out, I'm very sorry. Even right now, I'm getting a lot of like robot feedback on Discord, so if I jump out and jump back in, I'm very sorry, but I'm just having a lot of trouble today, but happy to be here.
And we have Rich here with us.
Yeah, I'm doing great. How are you guys?
Doing good. You excited to talk about Ukraine?
Yeah. Actually, we have a topic that's sort of Ukraine adjacent, which is our next debate topic, which we're going to spend about 2 months on in class. So I'm kind of glad to be like brushing up on it for this panel here.
Excellent.
The topic is about leaking classified information, and one of our counter plans that we're planning for that one is was the whistleblower process, which of course, had a big impact on Ukraine a couple of years ago.
Hey, non-smoker on Twitch. The second O is a 0. Resident schizo tanky, or so I've been dubbed. Happy to be part of yet another panel.
It is a good day. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Tiberius D. I talk a lot about geopolitics and ethics. It's always a fun conversation when I'm around. No, I'm lying. I'm actually quite a bit of a bore, but it's great to see so many wonderful people here yet again. Shout out to Cypher, Ico, and Dylan Burns. Great to see you all in the same house. This is going to be fun.
Let's start with something simple, like to get us warmed up for this conversation. Let's go with the question: Is there a point where the cost of supporting Ukraine becomes too high? And we're going to start it off with Cypher.
Yeah, I think that's clearly a yes to that one. The question is whether or not can we actually determine when that point starts, or do we have to wait until we get there? For right now, it seems like we're nowhere near that point where the cost to support Ukraine outweighs the benefits. Russia appears to be on the ropes and has been for a long time. It appears that the Ukrainians are actually doing things that we kind of want and what we would expect for a bloody democracy to do, even though they're currently experiencing an invasion by a relatively fascistic sort of force that they're experiencing, right? Yeah, I think if nuclear holocaust was a possibility, or I don't know, something along those lines, we could talk about it. Maybe, no boots on the ground from the United States, but I think there's no reason to fear any of those options currently. And that's it.
Okay. Dylan, what do you think?
I mean, there's a limit to any amount of support you can provide anyone for any conflict, no matter like how moral it is. I don't think there's any war. You could even go like, people would say like, what about World War II? But I mean, like if there was a scenario where if you continue to fight, like the entire world will literally explode. You can imagine a million different scenarios. The question is there any specific line, like you hit this dollar amount and we're all gonna tap out? No, I don't see any line like that we're approaching in the immediate future. I'm sure if it got to a certain point where the cost benefit analysis did not continue to mark out either for the United States, for the coalition supporting Ukraine, like the European Union, like NATO, or for Ukraine itself, for example, if they found that the war has gotten too brutal, it has gotten too tiresome, and with no foreseeable path forward towards victory, they say we're going to have to find some settlement or at least kick the can down the road for now. Then I'm sure that there is a limit to that, but I can't tell you exactly what that limit is until we get closer to it and we see the situation change on the ground, i.e., for example, polling data shows that the majority of Ukrainians no longer want to fight, that the toll has become too much.
Excellent. Excellent. Pitch.
Yeah, I find it interesting that Dylan talks about polling data in Ukraine because from what I remember, there was a poll after 2014 as to whether or not Ukrainians thought they should have been at war, and I think the majority of them did not want to go to war over Crimea at that time. But if you look at the polling now, like support is like much greater, obviously, because as predicted by some, taking Crimea wasn't enough. It was just the beginning of taking more and more land. But if you're asking when is the cost too high for the West more broadly, as opposed to for the Ukrainians in terms of the polling data that I just talked about, then I would say yes. I think what the world stands to gain from the resolution of this conflict, if it resolves in the right way, is preservation of the international rules-based order. And this is probably the largest threat to that, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, if not since World War II. The idea that borders don't move without the consent of the people inside those borders needs to continue. And if the international rules-based order is no longer served by that, if we have to break more rules than we respect in so doing, that's when the cost comes too high in my book.
Okay. I like that. Unsmoker.
Damn, dude. That's a great answer I just heard. Yeah, I guess I'm in the unenviable position of being totally alone on this, but I happen to think that any military assistance is too much. So $46 billion worth is definitely too much, and I'm definitely against any additional military support. I've actually said from the beginning that I never disagreed with humanitarian support. And even financial support, depending on what it is. I guess I'm, loans or things like that. I'm a little bit more flexible, or at least sympathetic or open to hearing the argument for. But yeah, I'm of the belief that military support is simply prolonging a conflict which probably could have ended a little over a year ago, last April. So.
Well, thank you for that. Tiberius, what do you think?
Yeah, so I'm definitely on the side that there is a cost to be paid here. I don't know exactly how high it is because I don't think people are looking at this in the context that they need to. This isn't just a Russia-Ukraine conflict. This is an American-Russian conflict. And in some regards, I think we need to think of this as like the last fight of the Cold War. We don't like the Russians. Now, we had an opportunity to kind of go a different way after the Soviet Union fell apart, but we really didn't. And we can have a chat about that if we need to. But the reality is that we're kind of back in the same situation, but in a worse one. Instead of being a broken communist state, the Russians have become a aggressive fascist state. And make a long story short here, keeping that in a box is absolutely something that we want to do, if not openly destroying the Russian state as a whole. We probably should have put the dagger in them back in '92, but we didn't, and we're probably paying the cost for that now.
I'm going to open it to the panel. Let's discuss.
I don't see how we could have done that in '92 because we were just coming off Glasnost and Perestroika. That would have been a big message to the world that reaching an olive branch to the west only gets a knife to your heart, which I remember seeing that lesson being learned with Gaddafi, right? Like he acquiesces, he does what the United States wants, and then he gets invaded by the West because of it. I don't know. I don't really think. I think we need to reward approaches from countries like that who are trying to like make peace with us and not slap their hand away. I think probably it was good to give them a chance to do that in the early 90s. It didn't work out, but I still think it was like the right thing to do.
So maybe I'll walk that last statement back here, and this is why. There is absolutely a level to where we didn't really play a particular role when it came to the Russians, and unlike what we did for Eastern Europe, right? Whenever the wall comes down, we help out the Hungarians, we help out the Baltic states, and eventually we fast track them into NATO. Remind you, that takes usually about 20 years to get into, and we basically brought them in at 5 from the fast track process. So to me, we absolutely could have been a lot more nice to the Russians, and I hate to put that in that kind of term, but I think we could have. The issue that I have here is that we really kind of played the inaction role. We didn't really take any kind of stance, and I don't know what a more aggressive stance towards the Russians would have been back in the 90s, but maybe that was an option we could have considered.
Supporting Yeltsin over Putin, like that was pretty aggressive, or at least Putin like interpreted that as pretty aggressive, and some people point to that as his reason for not wanting to work with the West.
Well, Putin's made a number of lists, but go ahead.
Well, yeah, I would say that I was probably right on that, you know, supporting Yeltsin against, I don't remember the guy's name, but whoever was as a political opponent, and literally kind of pushing the thumb on the scale a bit by helping them with their media campaigns and that sort of thing, using more of a kind of open market Western style of, for lack of a better term, propaganda to tilt that. Probably did turn Putin off, but he doesn't bring it up much. You know, Yeltsin basically gave the power he had. So
I'm actually curious, a little diverting off topic. I hope nobody minds. How are we defining fascism here? Because I've heard more than one person refer to Russia as fascist or pseudo-fascist, and to me that's like fucking totally insane. Like, and I'm not even Mr. Russia cheerleader. I mean, I'm in the position now where I'm going to sound like one. But how can we qualify Russia as fascist? Like, what definition of fascism are you using?
I'm being a little hyperbolic, so you can just ignore my.
Evidently, yeah. No, okay, that's fair. That's fair. I mean, Tiberius, I think you said it too.
Yeah, I did say it. I'm trying to bring up, I've got a pin post in my Discord of like what I think fascism is, and there's like 4 qualifications for it. I'm just trying to remember the alphabet because I can't do it off the top of my head. But
State-directed capitalism is one arm of it for sure, and strong military.
So
wait, hold on. Mm-hmm. What, state-controlled capitalism? You said
state-directed capitalism. Yeah, where there are markets.
No,
where there are markets, but the markets like serve the state. Yeah. I'm not saying that those
all markets serve states in some manner.
Although I never brought up the word fascism, just for the record.
Okay,
I'm just saying that's what I.
Could you at least acknowledge that that's an extreme statement?
That
Russia is fascist.
Well, hold on. If you're saying that the rest of the world, like the Western world more broadly, has fascistic elements in it, I don't see how.
No, dude, I'm not saying that. I'm saying neither are fascist.
Oh, okay. That's what I thought I heard you saying. I think there are specifics to the like original like 1940s Italian definition of fascism that might not fit, but I absolutely think that the oligarchs directing the markets in favor of the state are one element of fascism and have been historically like since the beginning, and strong military focus of the state. And of the society at large is another like large element. I assume those are 2 of Tiberius's 4.
And I would add to that. Sorry, Aiko, I didn't want to walk over you. If you have
no, I'm done.
Please finish. Okay. So I would add to that a strong adherence to some sort of mythical traditionalist value system. So when Russia started to turn on its gay population under Putin, then you could say that that's pretty authoritarian and could be fascistic. Doesn't mean that they are fascist, just to be clear.
All right. Sorry,
Ty was going to answer. Ty was going to give his answer to the question.
Yeah, just because I'm the one who did it, and I'm 100% going to defend this. So my 4 qualifications for fascism is this: 1, an anti-liberal institutionalism. This is basically anything that is I hate to put it in like that kind of context, but basically it's this. Voting, yeah, we don't really care for that. You're going to have an authoritarian system that is somewhat flexible, and I hate that whole termination, but that's what they call it. Hyper-nationalism, I definitely think we meet that qualification here, particularly under Party or Unity Russia. We have a strict social doctrine of behavior. That is pretty common throughout the entire Orthodox civilization, so they do not get excluded from this one. And then 4 is military expansionism, which is we've seen this in Georgia, we've seen this in Ukraine, and a few other particular conflicts that they've engaged with. So there's my 4 criteria for you.
Yeah, I mean, dude, it sounds like you could make an argument that any conservative society that's militaristic and expansionistic is fascist. And I just don't agree with that whatsoever, you know. And I mean, the reason that I'm really like hammering on it is because people use that word as a means of associating Russia with like Nazi fucking Germany, which is an insane thing to say. You know, and actually, if anything, is like denigrating the people who died in the fucking Holocaust. And there's a bitter twist of irony in all of this, being that so many people, well, and I'm not one of these people who says everyone in Ukraine is like this, but there's definitely a strong contingent of people, particularly within the Ukrainian military, who are radically far right and definitely like closer, you know, in terms of ideological composition to Nazi Germany than Russia's government. I just think it's a crazy statement.
Wait. Can we reel that in for a second? Would you say that like the Ukrainian population or the Ukrainian military is closer to like fascistic values overall than say the Russian government itself?
Azov is.
Well, Azov is one specific part.
That's why I said one dimension.
Okay, so if we take one unit, we can say that one unit is more fascistic than the Russian government.
Yes.
Okay, well then, okay, that statement means nothing. Okay.
No, it means something. It's just I'm not.
You could do this with. I could do this with any military. I could find any military in the world.
No,
there is a.
In the U.S. military. Where is the dimension of the U.S. military that's openly?
You don't think I can find a U.S. military unit where the values held by the people in that unit are more fascistic than the people who run the Russian government? I do think I could find.
Do you
think
like you could find a regiment within the U.S. military that's avowed neo-Nazis?
Avowed? No, but
as one of the people on this panel that actually been in the military, I'm gonna have to agree with at least the way he's framing this. Sorry, I'm non-smoker. I had to tab over to see names. Non-smoker on this, just to a degree, Dylan. Just because there isn't, to my knowledge, a whole unit, brigade, battalion, company, whatever that you could pin this to. Now, certain elements in the military, especially those that might have joined, let's say, Oath Keepers and those kind of people, maybe those people exist. And there are members of the military you could say are fascist, Nazis, far right-wing extremists, whatever, in that, but I wouldn't say a whole unit.
Well, I'd say it's too easy to root out when you're out in the open like that and say a whole regiment is like that. But I think that if we were invaded, if the United States were invaded, we know enough about white supremacists trying to infiltrate the military. We know that there are enough of them in there. And that if we were invaded and a regiment were to emerge that was explicitly racist, we would still let them fight for us if we were being invaded. Like, we would deal with that after the war. But I think we absolutely would let it happen. Because there have been too many wars in the past where that's been the case.
Well, I just wanted to make the original statement that I remembered. Maybe I misinterpreted it. Was that in the Ukrainian military there is a more of a fascist tinge than you could say if you were to compare it to the Russian government. And I don't agree with that at all. When you talk about the members of people who are not only elected to parliament and the Russian parliament, and those people who have tried to honor, for example, collaborationists when it comes to the freedom of Russia army that was done under Hitler's regime, or when it comes to statements of those close to the Kremlin or directly related to the Kremlin, that would mean that if you were to take the entirety of the Ukrainian military, its composition is more fascistic than the Russian government. Now, if we specifically concentrate on one military unit, one regiment, I think you can get closer to that dimensions. But even how we framed it, for example, Azov is explicitly they are avowedly neo-Nazi. The regiment, the Azov regiment, for example, the 3rd Assault Brigade, these are not avowedly neo-Nazi regiments. In fact, they are constantly trying to distance themselves from anti-Semitism and racism and neo-Nazism in their messaging and how they advertise themselves, because they have found that their roots in their original founder and how they advertise themselves and their military culture was actually a problem for them in trying to garner international support and trying to grow as a military unit, and they have made themselves more milquetoast. Does this mean that it's that there's not still a culture of racism or anti-Semitism? And well, this happens in a lot of organizations. For example, Marie Le Pen's party used to be an avowedly neo-Nazi, fascist, white nationalist party, and as it tried to expand, it made itself more and more milquetoast. That's not to say I like Marie Le Pen's party, but to say Marie Le Pen's party is a neo-Nazi party would be inaccurate.
And Russia supported Le Pen, for the record.
Okay, so wait, just so we're clear. So the good Nazis are fighting with Ukraine, and they're more milquetoast Nazis now, so it's okay.
I don't think you listened to anything I said.
No, I heard 10,000 words, which basically amount to that. Is there some key detail I'm missing?
Well, my point was that Azov's culture has changed over the last years. They're more milquetoast than they used to be, and trying to use it as an example of a stringent fascist tins in the Ukrainian military than say in the Russian government, I think is weak or flimsy at least. And that's not to say I like Azov. To be quite frank, I don't like Azov. I don't like Right Sector. There are a lot of groups that I don't like the volunteer Russian forces, the part of the people who went over the border recently. I don't like these organizations. Actually, that volunteer Russian forces, they are very, very far right, very fascistic. Yeah. I've interviewed some of the Ukrainian nationalists that people a lot of times point to as the Nazis and the fascists, for example, fighters in the Right Sector. I do not think that just labeling these organizations as neo-Nazi battalions or neo-Nazi units is an accurate portrayal of what they are. Are they far right? Are they ultra-nationalists? That is true. Do they have fascists within them at times? Yes, absolutely. They have Nazis within them as well. But I think calling them a Nazi military unit and avowedly Nazi military unit avowedly means that they say, hey, we're Nazis, not actually we're nationalists and there's this difference here, and hey, look at us, we're dancing with Jews, and they're trying to water down the messaging. That's not what avowedly means. You said avowedly.
Got it. Okay, so yeah, they're the good Nazis. Can I?
No, wait, no. Let me. Can I just ask? That's not what I. That's not what you said at all. Let me just say. You said avowedly, right? And now I was under the impression that avowedly means hello, we're Nazis, right? That's what I was under the impression of.
I'm very comfortable calling Azov avowed Nazis.
What is your definition of avowed then? As
close as we could possibly get to like modern day Nazis. And I think that even the U.S. Congress agreed with me, which is why there was legislation held up in, 2017, about sending funding to Ukraine until there was... Can
you just define what avowedly means?
The guy fucking... Listen, you guys are going to let...
What's happened in 5 years?
Okay. All right. Here's the point I'm trying to make. There is an official regiment in the Ukraine military that I would classify as being neo-Nazis, right? I would say that their ideological framework was a openly acknowledged thing that these were radically far-right groups, straight up with torch burnings and Sieg Heils and youth camps and all of the iconography and all of the central tenets of Nazism. And what I was trying to point to, and it's kind of coming out in this discussion now, is this obvious double standard that we can say, well, Russia's fascistic, and Tiberius can be like, well, here are these 4 amorphous characteristics of fascism that therefore makes Russia fascistic. And then we're also going to say, no, these guys who actually Sieg Heil and fucking, want death to non-white groups and all of this stuff, now they're involved in a war, and so is Dylan saying they're more milquetoast, or they're not as openly acknowledging their Nazi roots. That's okay. Those aren't fascists. Those are the milquetoast good Nazis. But, Putin is a fascist.
Okay.
It's just an obvious double standard. And it's what makes me crazy about this whole discussion is we act like there's no such thing as a rational Russian perspective. The Russians are automatically bad guys. It's just dumb, like brain dead level thinking.
Okay.
And I don't understand it at all.
So first off, I didn't call Russia a fascist state. When everybody was debating that, I just stayed quiet because I don't bother myself with those words. I think ultra-nationalists, I think there's a lot of words you can use to describe them. I don't tend to call them fascist. The word I most often hear in Ukraine is like as a twist of these two, like Russist. This idea of like Russian fascism is something I hear in Ukraine, but I'm not tied to these words. So I don't think it's hypocrisy for me to be quiet during that segment. And then when you call an organization that is not avowedly neo-Nazi, because I am honest about how the organization has changed over the years, just like Marine Le Pen's party has changed over the years. Marine Le Pen's party was an openly neo-Nazi party led by a Holocaust denier. The founder of the Wagner Group was not the Wagner Group, the Wagner Group's founder was also a neo-Nazi, but the founder of Azov was also a neo-Nazi white supremacist fascist. And I can say that to call Azov in its current form as it has had to become milquetoast, not only due to the cultural changes and it's growing and it getting more attention and wanting to raise more money, but also through its integration with the military, since it evolved from the little black men is what they used to be called in 2014, right when they formed out of what was essentially football hooligans. They have gone through these transitions, just like other far-right groups have, for example, in France. I'm not endorsing them. I didn't say Azov was good. I'm just saying your classification of them is inaccurate. Also, my response isn't to come out here and just play defense of Azov. The only reason I'm doing this is because you tried to basically say, actually, Russia isn't the real fascist. This is ridiculous. In fact, it's hypocritical because in the Ukrainian military, there's a lot more fascism than in the Russian government. That was what I was objecting to.
And to be fair to Dylan, when I said fascistic, he rolled his eyes. So
Rich.
Let's just be real about this, okay?
Okay, Rich.
Hey, along those lines of Le Pen, I'm just thinking about like ultra-nationalist sort of right-wing parties in Europe. I'm thinking about Le Pen. I'm thinking about the National Rally in France. I'm thinking about UKIP in the UK and the Brexit Party, or Belgium has the Von Belong with the AfD in Germany. These are all Eurosceptic parties, right? They would like to take their countries out of the EU. I think to a large degree, a lot of them also would like to not be in NATO. That doesn't sound like the direction that Ukraine's going. Like, and I have no idea what like Azov's like position is on being in the EU or being part of NATO. But if you're ultra nationalist, then it seems to me that you want to like stick to your own and not join some like larger sort of Western hegemonic power, right?
The right wing in Eastern Europe, though, and the way it developed historically, was in opposition to Soviet hegemony, not European hegemony, not Western European hegemony and American hegemony. So these groups, these far-right ultra-nationalistic groups, what is nationalism? Nationalism is the assertion of a national identity, which should take precedence over, the state, right? It should be a state, a nation state, right? A state defined by this core group, this nation. And it's a means through which states assert their independence and their sovereignty, or supposed, like self-determination against some sort of, overbearing sphere of influence. In the West, France, England, all the places you just mentioned, the UK, these are places that are trying to assert their independence from this sphere of, European or EU hegemony, American hegemony. In Eastern Europe, it's not just Ukraine, by the way. It's all of these, Eastern European regions that were part of the Eastern Bloc or former Soviet republics. Nationalist movements there are strictly defined as being, we are not, or they're one of their core tenets anyways, we are through and through not Russian, right? We are anti-Russian. We're opposed to Russia, and in many cases, they want to move closer to the European sphere of influence because it will pull them out of that Russian sphere.
Isn't Zelensky an ethnic Russian? Like he's standing opposed to Russia, of course, because he was invaded, but he was an ethnic Russian, right? He's not just a Ukrainian. Like, yeah, but
Zelensky's not a Ukrainian far-right activist. Zelensky is just the president of Ukraine. And you're right. I don't think he's become. In fact, I think that it's fair to say, I don't know if Dylan would totally agree with this, but Zelensky was not the most radically anti-Russia person either until the SMO. So
Well, it's the SMO. I'm
Well,
sorry, I'm not good with that.
military
well,
operation.
Zelensky was elected actually on a quote unquote pro peace platform. It was not what made him win, though. A lot of people use that to show that as an example of, see, the Ukrainian people wanted to concede. That's not the reason he won. Was because he wasn't Petro Poroshenko. He was an establishment oligarch. The deliveries of the Euromaidan revolution that they thought were also very much based on anti-corruption, Petro Poroshenko was not delivering on. And as much as he like touted his three pillars, like about military reform, language reform, it was not enough to get him over the line. The pro peace platform may have gotten him some support, but it wasn't the main reason he won. And this also did lead to him winning actually Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporozhye, all of the territories that are currently facing some form of Russian occupation. When it comes to right sector, it's really interesting because I went to a right sector base and I interviewed one of their soldiers specifically because I wanted to learn about Ukrainian ultra-nationalism. I've always been somewhat critical of right sector and their activities against LGBT pride in 2015. A lot of their beliefs I do not agree with. If you just go to their website, it's like the liberal decadent, it's stuff that I just generally don't agree with. So I wanted to sit down and talk to them because I think a lot of time there's not a lot of material from right sector interviews in English. And one of the things I walked away with is that number one, a lot of these people in these groups don't have an ideology. They joined either A, because the regular Russian military wouldn't take them, and right sector has a lot less standards than the normal Ukrainian military, or B, it was the local military unit, and when the war started, everybody just ran to what other group would let them pick up a gun. So like half of them are like that. Then the other group that I met somebody who was an ideologically devoted fighter, fighting since 2014 in right sector, joined because he's an ultra-nationalist. And he sounded to me a little bit kind of like the 3%ers back in the United States. It's kind of hard to say an American equivalent because our history is so different than Ukraine, but it is very similar to how it was being described earlier. If America was invaded, all these, some of them somewhat crazy militiamen, very right-wing militiamen, would pick up guns, go into the hills, make regiments, start fighting against the government. And eventually they would be integrated in some form to fight against the government. That's what right sector is. The only difference is that it has existed long enough to grow to an extent and accept so many people that many of them are no longer even that ideologically devoted anymore. It's like half and half. It's really weird.
That is very interesting. So with that being the case, I want to get to one of the things I posted. Which
Can I say one more thing about this topic before we move on? Because I am going to forget this. Because I'm working on this interview to release very soon. If you take in the last elections in Ukraine in 2019, during Zelensky's election when he got elected, the far right coalition, Azov, Right Sector, Svoboda, and a few other groups made what was like the nationalist bloc to run in the election so they could pass the 5% threshold. So they would have people in the Rada, which is Ukraine's legislator. They got 2.3%. So when it comes to the Ukrainian population, these groups are very marginal when it comes to support politically. In the military, that's actually where they have their most PR. It's where they have they get their most attention from. They're very, very little success politically.
And it's useful to say that the any of the far right groups within Ukraine have lost support immensely since 2014. Over the years, they've gotten less and less members in parliament. Doesn't matter what the group is, that's just happened.
Oh yeah, Svoboda especially. They crashed. They crashed. Right sector as well, honestly. Right sector. I mean, people don't even hear about right sector anymore. Now it's all Azov, and even the political wing of Azov, the Azov, the National Corps. They have not been able to get anybody elected to the Rada either. They were part of that coalition. Altogether, they couldn't pass 5%. They couldn't even get half of it.
Yeah.
So
Dylan, do they
before
have
we
a
get
pos-
way too far off
does
of
the
it, can we
political
talk about Wagner?
We can talk about Wagner. Why not?
Yeah, can I ask one quick question? It won't. I promise it's not to start a new thing. I just want to ask this quick question. Do you know of the political wings? Because I wasn't aware there was a political wing for Azov. Do any of them have a position on EU membership?
It's weird because some of them are very for it, very similar to what Non-Smoker was talking about, because they see it as a way to power balance against the Russians and to empower Ukraine against them. Some of them support it for economic reasons, but there's others who are very skeptical about these groups because they see them as like the EU has these certain standards when it comes to, you know, gay people and how they say, I don't feel comfortable with that, or I don't feel comfortable with, you know, what the Western decadence is on on like and like any number of like, oh, how women and feminism and stuff like that. And so I think something that's going to be interesting is how a lot of these ultranationalists are going to react once the integration with the EU happens, which is going to happen. I think it's inevitable at this point, and they see that there's going to be certain standards Ukraine is going to have to hold itself to. In fact, when I was interviewing the right sector fighter, I asked him about the legislation in the Rada, and it was the most passionate I saw him got in the entire interview. Was him talking about how just keep it out of public, but this does seem to be the future path Ukraine is taking, and it's going to mean probably more protections for marginalized communities in Ukraine.
Interesting.
So you had a Freudian slip earlier, and you were talking about Azov, and you said Wagner, and you were saying the founder of Wagner is also Nazi.
Yes. Well, Utkin, not Prigozhin. Utkin. There's two different leaders. It's kind of complicated, but yes.
Okay. Didn't know if you wanted to expound on that and whether or not they're as fascistic as the government itself, or how big the faction of Nazism is within that faction.
Wagner's complicated because there are fascists in Wagner, but Wagner takes like basically anyone, a lot of people from prison, and there are fascists in the Russian prison system that get recruited. But it's honestly, the group I would point to more as an example of like fascism within the Russian military would be a lot of the groups that have been fighting way before the 2022 invasion. Rusich, which was involved in the Kherson occupation and operations across the whole country, an avowedly open Russian neo-Nazi organization. Wagner, of course, has a history with neo-Nazism. A lot of like really religious fanatical militia groups that have been fighting since 2014, even if they're not avowed neo-Nazis, still like ultra-nationalists that have been involved in war crimes against religious minorities, torture, other stuff. Wagner has gotten notorious not even due to its political leanings, mostly just due to its behavior and its use of prisoners when it comes to the sledgehammer executions, the castrations of POWs, stuff like that. I think a lot of it is because they kept a lot of the brutal prison culture. That when they recruited prisoners, they kept the prison culture as well. And Prigozhin has been very open about this, about how they respect the prison culture in Wagner and the prison caste system that had developed in Russia. And if you keep a prison culture in your military unit, it's not going to be that surprising that those people who are conditioned in that way, once also pumped full of ultra-nationalist propaganda, are going to engage in castrations and war crimes and stuff like that. It's also separate from the Russian government, which allows Russia to be separate from a lot of the activities they've engaged in, because this isn't even the first time they've been engaged in war crimes. They've engaged in war crimes in Africa. In fact, they actually, I remember there was footage that came out of them torturing a Libyan man with sledgehammers, I think, back in the day. I think it was like 5-6 year old that footage came out. So, I mean, it's less ideological and more a gang.
Yeah, it's very, so just piggyback off of what everything Dylan just said, it's more along the lines of, like you said, a gang, but also just their sheer brutality in every single theater that they participate in. And that's why the autocrats like them, because they do these terroristic kind of actions where they just go through and murder whole villages, or go through and be like, you're all dead, and then you have to kill that person if you want to stay alive, kind of thing. This is the stuff that they do. And so, like, in various countries in Africa, they've done this. They've done this in the Eastern Europe. Anywhere they go, they do all this stuff, and that's why they suck.
That's fair. That's a great assessment.
I do want to do something, and I'm going to do this because not a lot of people take the time for this, but the Russian prison system is incredibly brutal. It's very, very bad. America's prison system is also very bad, but Russia's prison system is also notoriously bad. It isn't surprising to me that a lot of people would make the decision to pick up arms, even if they don't believe in what's going on in Ukraine, just as a way to get out of that system, and then are surprised to find the conditions that they find themselves in, where surrendering can be met with 20 years to possibly a death sentence by sledgehammer, of retreating is something that is very frowned upon and punished, torture is a regular occurrence, beatings are a regular occurrence, and ultimately, even though, of course, Wagner's been involved in a lot of atrocities, these are people also in incredibly desperate situations, and it has been expressed to me that not only does this make them incredibly fierce fighters, even if they don't know a lot of times what they're doing since they're given so much little training, but it's also an incredibly tragic situation where I think that the use of prisoners in warfare is immoral, and the Ukrainians have done it to a smaller extent as well, and I didn't like it then, and I don't like this now. Definitely when we're talking about people involved in very violent, vile crimes like rape and murder, which was actually encouraged to grab. They were encouraged to grab rapists and murderers. Prigozhin has said this openly.
Thank you for enlightening me on that. I didn't know they were basically a prison gang given military weaponry. That is a bit of nuance I didn't understand myself.
I'm going to disconnect and reconnect. I'm sorry. I cannot hear anything you're saying. I'll be right back. Jesus Christ, the audio is so bad. Come on.
Yeah.
He's just having
That was
connection
very
problems.
enlightening. So I was going to get on to the second topic, which is Belgorod. We'll wait till he comes back.
And I also have one other line of questioning for him when he gets back, if it's
Oh.
okay.
I'm back. The connection's still terrible, but I'll power through it.
Okay, let's see if you can hear this, Dylan, and anybody else can weigh in on this too. But it seems to me that what we were talking about before with the political parties, especially like Le Pen and the National Rally in France, the AfD, UKIP, the fact that these organizations like get funding from Russia, that sounds to me, it confirms a little bit what non-smoker is saying in terms of, yeah, if the hegemony that I'm fighting against is in the West, then I'm going to be opposed to the West, and if I'm in the East, then it's going to be the other way around. That kind of makes sense. But if their funding is coming from Russia, is there kind of a little bit of horse theory coming around here, where far right in Western Europe is really sort of allied with Russia, even if they don't have like the same ideological goals necessarily? And might this explain like some of the social conservatism, like sort of rearing its head in terms of propaganda from the East? Because that appeals a lot to conservatives.
I mean, the main reasons I hear from people, and I'm doing a piece right now about how Russian propaganda has influenced American media and how it affects people, about the Russian like propaganda sphere. The reasons people give me for why they don't support Ukraine or for example, even some examples want Ukraine to lose are very varying. Sometimes when it comes to not supporting Ukraine, it's just solely a look, I want to take care of my own. That's whatever, there's a war. I don't really know anything about it. It's halfway across the world. At the end of the day, kitchen table issues are kitchen table issues. That's what I care about. And that is the argument that I am the most sympathetic towards, because I can understand that argument. But a lot of times when it comes to the very far right, the coalition of the far right, which Putin has developed and the Russian government has developed a relationship with over the years, is that many of them view Vladimir Putin as one of the last persons holding up Christendom, one of the last people holding up against the degeneracy of liberalism, of the globo homo. This is something you'll even sometimes hear directly from like Russian commanders or Chechen commanders talking to their soldiers, where they'll talk about needing to fight the shaitan in the West is something you'll hear from a Chechen commander, or the idea that they're going to come and make your kids trans and gay. This is stuff that has been said by officers to their soldiers out in the field to try to inspire them to go die in the trenches because the West is going to make your kids trans. And that type of messaging, which Vladimir Putin has leaned into during the announcement of the war, he was referencing J.K. Rowling. Why would he be referencing J.K. Rowling if he wasn't aiming for a certain demographic to consider his words more carefully? They want to kind of advertise themselves as the based super Chad awesome force against the liberal Ukraine. That's why people like Nick Fuentes and other white nationalists are very sympathetic. When I went to the Rage Against the War Machine rally, one of the first people I saw was Matthew Heimbach, the former founder of the white Students Union, and communication director for the American Nazi Party. But I also there would find people from very left-wing organizations where the interests are very different, but they have found themselves in coalition. And I don't think that's necessarily because they share some ideological thread with a lot of these people, with the fascists or the racists or the Nazis. It could be for completely different reasons. Something I hear a lot is we don't want to enrich the military-industrial complex, which is a very
enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yes, exactly. The enemy is my enemy is my friend. There is some weird overlap with like the MAGA communists and like some weird like middle ground where they seem far right, but they're also saying they're far left, like the Nazboli type behavior. Those people exist as well. And if they're a Nazbol, they almost certainly support the Russians. But besides that, it seems more like an enemy of my enemy is my friend situation.
This is a lot of Dylan monologues. I just wanted to say, it doesn't feel very much like a panel.
Well, sorry for that. You want to get to the next topic, or did you have anything to add to what was just said?
No, I mean, listen, it's just these are long ass speeches, so there's several things I could question or critique. Look, and it's not like I disagree with every single thing Dylan's saying either. You know, I mean, like I would say. Some of that, okay, the ideological alignment that the far right has with Russian conservatism on many issues, that's definitely true, right? I don't think that, and maybe I'm misunderstanding the initial question here, I really don't think that we can like simplify, the rise in far right groups in Western Europe as being something that's the result of Russian funding or anything like that. I think that ignores the very populist nature, let me put it this way: the popular appeal that some of that messaging has in places that are rural, that are underserved in Western Europe, that feel alienated from this, cosmopolitan liberal culture of like, European hegemony. But okay, yeah, can we move to the next topic? Because I'd like a chance for to maybe respond to something instead of just going and trying to pick apart an essay. You know what I'm saying?
Anybody else ready for next topic? Okay, so anti-Putin Russians say they launched a cross-border attack from Ukraine. So far, what has happened in Belgorod is supposedly anti-Putin Russian nationals who are aligned with the Ukrainian army have claimed responsibility for an attack in Russian southwest region of Belgorod, within the borders of northeastern Ukraine. So is this actually what's happening? Is this a good thing? Is this showing a different kind of resolve coming from Russian sentiment? Or is this just a psyop? So we'll start with CSP.
I think it might be a little bit of both, because there's so much stuff that's happening on the ground that is being exploited by whoever is trying to shape the narrative at the moment, kind of thing, right? So when one of the there's another example of this, right? I'm bad with names, but there's been a supposed Ukrainian general that's dead. And people were posting pictures from 4 weeks ago saying he wasn't dead. Look, this was where he's at. And then somebody else came in and said, well, look, this was from 4 weeks ago. How can you tell he's alive? Sort of thing. So I'm not really sure what the facts on the ground are at this moment. But it does appear to be there's some stuff going on there. And I know that was a lot of me saying nothing. So I'll let somebody else go.
All right, Dylan.
I don't think you could really use this border incursion to indicate any support from the Russian population. The RVC, the Russian Volunteer Corps, is an extremely far-right militia that isn't even technically associated with the Ukrainian military, but the Ukrainian military almost certainly assists them in crossing the border. And the Freedom of Russia Legion, which is made up of a lot of Russian prisoners of war who've decided to join with the Ukrainians, and other Russians who have joined up. They're not the same. They're different. They're more okay, which they're also larger. They were obviously sponsored by the Ukrainian government in some way to go into Russia, almost in the same way of, oh, we didn't invade Ukraine. These are all, these are just people rising up against your forces. It's cheeky. It's cheeky in the way of how the Russians have behaved towards Ukraine in Donetsk and Luhansk over the 8 years, and in a very small way, the Ukrainians feel like they have done something to a similar fashion back to them for like 48 hours. If anything, it was most likely a PR stunt more than anything else. Maybe it brings a lot of the attention away from what happened in Bakhmut after a 10-month a slugfest. I think that was probably a contributing factor, and I do think it succeeded in bringing the attention away from Bakhmut. I'm sure there would probably be some disagreement on this panel of exactly how important Bakhmut was as a battle. Ultimately, though, I do think that, and this is I think the more important long-term effect of this, that we could start to see this happen a lot more across locations all across the Russian border. If the Russian government is shown to be unable to protect its own border, that is extremely embarrassing for the Russians, who have been very muted in the response to this. When this war was supposed to last like probably a month and is now going on 2 years, and now there's Ukrainian soldiers, well, not Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian-backed Russian forces marching across Russian territory. And I don't think this will even be the last example of this happening. So this could be a trend of things to come. I don't think they're going to try to take all of a province or control all of a province. I don't see that in the near future, if anybody's wondering that.
Thank you. Rich?
Well, I don't know the granular details that people who pay closer attention to the facts on the ground are, like Non-Smoker and Dylan do. But I have seen like reports like from Russian state TV that they were able to chase the invaders out back to Ukraine, and then once in Ukraine, wipe them out entirely, 100%. And then I've seen reports from those freedom fighter Russian people themselves, who say that they got 2 wounded and 0 casualties on that operation, and it was a complete success. So I can't, obviously, you can't trust like every report that comes out, especially from like either side of the faction. But I will say this: it seems to me that if you look at the 2 times where there were, like in Kherson and before that up further north, where there were like major gains in territorial like acquisitions, before they were able to do that, they created distractions elsewhere in the country that sort of caused Russia to sort of reallocate their resources for like false operations, and so that they were then able to go in at weak spots that weren't concentrated. I think it's possible that this was a PR attempt, but one that's oriented towards getting Russia to feel less confident in extending its forces further into Ukraine and pull them back a little bit to the border for defensive operations. And doing so might make it easier to liberate more Ukrainian territory, like far away from Belgorod. Like that's just my guess.
Okay, that was elaborate. Thank you, Rich. Non-Smoker.
Yeah, it's weird the way you phrased the question. I wasn't exactly sure what you meant, but look, this might be one of the few times I like completely agree with Dylan fucking Burns. I think that, pretty much everything Dylan said. I think that this is a response to Bakhmut. I think that both these groups, RDK, LSR, they're definitely supported by Ukraine, backed by Ukraine. This does not represent a broader, like, anti-Putin movement that's going to result in, like, militia groups in Russia rising up to overthrow Putin or help Ukraine. I even think that groups in Russia that are distinctly anti-Putin would probably not be willing to overthrow the government by military forces. And even if that were, the supposed goal of some group there, that doesn't even align with the actions that took place. This was like essentially like a low level, sort of attack, distraction, sort of diversion, obviously from a military strategy standpoint from what happened in Bakhmut. I think it kind of just is as simple as that. There's a few different ways I'm tempted to go with this. Like, for example, both of these groups being extremely far-right neo-Nazi or neo-Nazi adjacent groups that are also, once again, aligned with Ukraine. But I'll leave that on the table for take that off the table for a different discussion.
Interesting. Thank you for that, Tiberius.
Yeah, so I'm going to go with Cypher a little bit on the first part of this, in which I don't have a lot of on-the-ground intelligence regarding this particular thing. It really just kind of came out of nowhere. So here's what I do know and what I can highly speculate to. Number one is that this would be shocking to me if the Ukrainians do not have their fingerprints all over this, because it literally was launched out of Ukraine, at least from everything we can tell. And it's going at the one of the two major strategic points within Russia that the Ukrainians need to shut down as a logistics target, and that's Belgorod. The other one is Rostov-on-Don, which is very convenient that it's Belgorod, because it's the exact opposite direction on the compass from where I think the Ukrainians are going to launch their next offensive. So for me, this just kind of checks off all the boxes of what Ukraine needs to do to distract the Russians to the point where they can open up the offensive here probably in the next coming weeks. But I'll just leave that for the open.
Excellent. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up. Everybody can discuss.
I want to say, Ikovic, you brought up something, your point about it possibly wanting to, the Ukrainians wanting to make the Russians pull back more forces from its offensive operations or its defensive operations, Zaporozhye and occupied territory, to pulling back in the Russian territory proper, so they have to defend their border. That's also very valid as well. You're not the first person I've heard say that. I was talking about that on stream a few days ago. I do think that could be valid as well, but that's more speculation. That's more speculation in my mind.
Right. Yeah. I said it was a guess.
The thing is with anti-Putin forces that are willing to do violence in Russia itself, none of them are prominent enough to grab on the territory. Some of them are engaged in violence. Boak, for example, is engaged in trail derailments. They are engaged in targeting recruitment centers. That's an anarchist anti-Putin group that has been engaged in probably more, I know, like dozens of different bombings and fire attacks on different locations across the country. They do not have enough influence or enough power to hold on to territory. The goal of this operation, I mean, it would be a real shock if all it took was a few guys, which are essentially football hooligans from the RVC, to just march over the border and say, unite the Rus tribe, and then they overthrow the government. That wasn't going to happen. At least at the time being, it's a ridiculous fantasy. I do think, though, that whether or not this is going to have a long-term effect on how the Russian government is viewed and its ability to defend its own territory, where what was once called a special military operation has now led to what is essentially Ukrainian-sponsored militias crossing into Russian-occupied territory and holding it for over a day or two. What does that say about the Russian government's ability to protect its own territory? What does that say about the Russian government's ability to protect its own people? One of Putin's main arguments is an argument of stability, that, hey, he's been in power for a while, you know, he might not be the most, you know, freedom-loving guy and freedom of speech and all these things, but he keeps the country stable. He led the country out of the chaos of the Yeltsin administration, the drunkard who mismanaged the country. But now there's militias that are marching into Russian territory. Now there are drone attacks on FSB offices in Belgorod. There are drone attacks near the Kremlin. There are bombings here. There are bombings there. That image of the Kremlin stability that Putin provided, that I am curious if that's going to fade away the longer stuff like this happens, and if there's going to be more incursions across the border in the future, or possibly larger incursions across the border in the future, if the Russians don't reinforce their border.
Also, I think there's a little bit of irony here, like, you know, this idea of Belgorod like becoming independent. I think there's got to be a lot of people trying to make parallels between that and the Donetsk region, and if are they going to start asking for autonomy, leveraging like Russia's support for these sorts of states? And if Russia's already calling them terrorists, so does that give more room in terms of propaganda for Ukraine to say, okay, if that's terrorism, then what's been happening in Donetsk since 2014 is also terrorism?
I think, honestly, the thing that interested me most, but I can't comment much on because I don't think that was the attempt on, is that there was a Washington Post article that released, I think, like 2 or 3 weeks ago that really revealed a more aggressive side of Zelensky. Not giving that any negative connotation. He just was a lot more aggressive than what is seen on the international stage, where he is pressing his advisors about marching troops into Russian territory and holding on to Russian territory, and an idea that if there was a negotiated settlement, he could trade Russian occupied territory for Ukrainian occupied territory. And so after reading that article about a month ago, when I hear about Russian-backed groups, Ukrainian-backed groups marching into Russian territory, that does get on the mind. If the Russians do not reposition troops in order to protect its border, if this small contingent of Russian militia, anti-Putin Russian militia, was able to occupy Russian territory, is that a real risk in the future? Before, I would have more ha-ha'd the idea, but I mean, we know that Zelensky has discussed it in private. We now have seen Ukrainian-backed forces march into Russia without much resistance, with a very small force. I have heard from my friend, because he walked by, heard me say this, that they have repositioned some troops and they're taking some troops out of other areas. But the more they do that, the more they're going to strain resources for defending Zaporozhye, Donetsk, Luhansk, or any possible future offensive operations.
No, I mean, okay, so that's, now I disagree with that anyway, at least as far as I think I understand it. So look, I don't think that, I wouldn't describe what occurred in this region as it being captured for any amount of time in actuality. I mean, I guess you could argue like a military presence there, or like paramilitary presence there, could constitute in some way like I don't know, like an occupation of some sort, but it was a day essentially, and they were completely driven out. I also don't think that the connection Dylan's making about this aggressive sort of bent Zelensky has and potential vulnerabilities in the Russian homeland, or in the Russian front. I think that Ukraine, quite frankly, has endured a tremendous amount of casualties, as have the Russians. But as I understood it, Bakhmut falling has been such a significant setback for the Ukrainian military that they've kind of had to delay the spring offensive as a result of this. It's clearly like a morally significant win for Russia and a morally significant loss for Ukraine. And to respond with a tiny, militia-led, sort of like a renegade group backed by Ukraine, not even officially part of the Ukrainian military, rushing into this village or this region for a period of time and then being driven out is somehow indicative of like huge vulnerabilities in Russia, or like the capability of the Ukrainian military. I don't think the Ukrainian military has the resources, the manpower, in general, to be able to then invade Russia and not at the cost of significant amount of Ukrainian territory being lost.
They don't need to do a significant invasion of Russia in order to pull Russian forces back from what is currently the front lines in order to recapture Russian territory proper, mind you. So I think that's the point that Dylan Burns was actually getting at.
No, I understand the point. I disagree with that. I think that
why do you disagree with that?
Because a small militia group.
Can I clarify what I said? Because I said, sure, I'm curious if this is still on the table. I'm not advising it. In fact, I would advise Zelensky against doing something like that. I think he should concentrate on liberating his own territory. I also think it somewhat confuses the message. In the grand scheme of things, would it be morally permissible? In my mind, yes. This is how any other country would pursue war. Yes, I will occupy your territory if you will occupy mine. Any other country would do the same thing in their position if they have the ability to. But I think they should concentrate on their own land. I'm curious because we know that Zelensky has proposed this in private meetings. Now we have Russian-backed, Ukrainian-backed Russian forces going into Russian territory. And I know it is a weird thing for me to wrap my head around about Ukrainian soldiers occupying Russian territory for a longer period of time, but we've seen the Russian line crumble before. The Kharkiv counteroffensive is the most clear example of the Russians stretching their forces too thin, positioning a bunch of troops in Bakhmut and other areas to try to concentrate on a counteroffensive and not being prepared for Ukrainian counteroffensive, which led to the liberation of the entirety of the Kharkiv Oblast. And that's why I think the Russians are going to have to respond to this in some way, either by reinforcing their line on the border, which means they're straining resources elsewhere, or they're going to not have to do that and risk future Ukrainian incursions, which would be not only a propaganda loss, but also could, if Zelensky was to be so bold, I would vote against this happening, could lead to Zelensky actually considering that plan again to go into Russian territory occupied and trade it. I don't think that's very likely, though. As for when it comes to Bakhmut, the main victory for the Russians in Bakhmut is PR. And this is, I think, I'm not the first person to say this, but Bakhmut is not an extremely significant city, but it became significant due to the amass of resources and manpower that was expended there, and then the image Bakhmut became for a lot of Ukrainians. They saw, I mean, I heard the song all the time on the radio, like Bakhmut, Fortress Bakhmut was played constantly on the radio here, and people would crank it up. They really loved that song. For the Russians, it was the next victory that they could have, a victory to rebound from the losses of losing in the Kharkiv counteroffensive, losing the Kherson counteroffensive, being pushed back from Kiev. The last victory they had was the capture of Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, which has been a while. But when it comes to it being a logistical supply hub that I saw David Sachs and others talking about, the city is gone. It no longer exists. The idea of using it as a logistical supply hub seems silly. The Soledar salt mines, which does give them advantage, that was captured months ago. They could have avoided capturing Bakhmut itself while also capturing the Soledar salt mines, which protects ammunition. Its main service to the Russians is as a stepping stone to Kramatorsk, which if they took 10 months to take Bakhmut, they're not taking Kramatorsk at any time in the near future, and as a PR victory. Outside of that, I don't think it's a significant loss for the Ukrainians. And if its main hurt to the Ukrainians, if its main damage to the Ukrainians was a morale loss, I do think that the Ukrainians wiped a lot of that away by marching into Russian territory proper. In the last 48 hours, I've seen a lot of news, a lot of people joking and laughing about taking Russian villages. I haven't seen a lot of people talking about Bakhmut. I've seen a lot more people talking about capturing Russian villages.
But
I'm
there's
not,
a couple.
Go ahead. You know, you want to respond to his long thing. That's fine. I'm cool with that. Go ahead.
All right, thanks, Ken. Yeah, I mean, so if look, PR moves should not be understated. Even if it was just that, that's still really significant. Why? Because Ukraine is pretty reliant on good PR in terms of their military performance, because much of their ability to defend themselves is totally dependent on outside support. And one of the reasons we're having this panel is because of the fall of Bakhmut. And one of the initial questions was, is it worth, or is there a dollar amount at which we should stop supporting Ukraine? Presumably that question has come to light because we've seen, despite the fact that we've committed billions of dollars, over $40 billion in military support to this, the Ukrainian resistance, there has still been significant territorial losses, which many of us on my end of the political spectrum have been arguing was an inevitability. So a PR loss is really significant, as is, as is any sort of morale, blow to the morale. But to say that it's an indicator that there's no sort of like a loss in Ukrainian morale because they used Russian, pseudo, let's call them what they are, right? Like, it's not even reasonable, I think, to call them Russian separatists. They're Russians in the service of the Ukrainian military. But to use
Ukrainian-backed Russian forces.
Sure. Ukrainian-backed Russian forces in this small renegade sort of, far right, ragtag little group go and rush them into a village to play, basically like a game of distraction, right? To sort of sway the Russian military's focus away from this big victory. I call it a big victory because, again, for Wagner and the Russian military, who did pour lots of, manpower and money of their own into winning this epic battle,
and
they succeeded.
Right?
Well,
I got
This battle's been going on for more than a year.
Go ahead.
Okay, I don't know if I don't want to take up everybody else's speaking time. I do have something to say, but if
too late for that, bro.
Yeah, I mean, we deferred though. I do have a counterpoint though. I just pulled up the territorial map of where current things lay as far as where territory Russia controls and what territory is currently contested, etc. And I don't see this as significant. This is the exact same place Russia's been at for the last almost 2 years. So why would we care?
Because
So real quick,
they've been there
I want to
because they
say
haven't been
I
able to advance
appreciate
past-
Dylan's enlightening us on these subjects because he has firsthand knowledge in a lot of instances. So if anybody has something to say while he's speaking, go ahead and raise your hand, and then we'll try to wrap it up so we can get someone else to say something, just to make it easier.
Appreciate that.
Cool.
No, non-smoker, what were you going to say?
No, I was just saying to say that Russia hasn't advanced past that point, so it indicates that it's not significant. Do you not see the flaw in that logic?
Well,
like it's
can I
significant
ask
because
you
they're
then? Can I ask you because if you were to put up the Kharkiv and Kherson counteroffensive, which were the most recent big military engagements before the capturing of Bakhmut, they captured tens of thousands, like tons and tons and tons of square mileage of territory, liberated the only provincial capital that the Russians have captured. Maybe like during the last 6 months to 7 months of fighting around Bakhmut, they've captured 1/40th of what was captured during those counteroffensives, in what was extremely costly fighting, where according to the Jax Textera documents, they took a lot more casualties than the Ukrainians, and I have no reason to believe that those leaked documents were falsified outside of the one that Tucker Carlson, of course, broadcasted because Tucker Carlson. But I don't understand what is so significant about this specific territory. If it's about PR, then I would argue that the smart thing to do, if you just want PR victories and not real victories and pouring tens of thousands of lives into something that actually changes the power balancing on the ground, it's a lot easier to do, for example, a drone strike near the Kremlin where a drone blows up, or, for example, walk across the border for 2 days, get a lot of press, and pull out. It's a lot easier to speak at the Oscars and a lot less costly. And you said that the original topic for this was about, Bakhmut, and that just shows how important it was. Okay, but what was the topic changed to once the Ukrainians crossed the border? It was changed to crossing the border. And so I think that shows that, yeah, it seems to have grabbed a little bit of PR attention. It does seem to have gotten the world's attention. I've been seeing Russian Civil War memes on Twitter for the last 72 hours. It's been a blast.
All right, non-smoker.
No, Dylan, it means that the Belgorod thing is an extension of Bakhmut. That's what it means.
Is that how everyone's talking? Is that
Bakhmut?
everybody is talking about the Russian Civil War and the border crossings? Is looking at the Russian Volunteer Corps press conference. They're looking at Prigozhin going on the Telegram to say the end is near. The Russian military defense is shit. That's what they're seeing. I don't think everybody is making the connection that you are or I am to Bakhmut every time we see that. And even if they are making that connection, that still doesn't remove from the embarrassment of the moment for the Russians.
Yeah, I'm going to have to agree with Dylan on this one to a degree, just because, yes, it is part of a PR push. We understand that. But I think everybody on the panel agrees that the incursion into actual Russian territory by this, I don't know, rebel group, we'll say, is part and parcel of what is going on. Probably 100%. There's no disagreement for me on that. But does that matter? I don't think that matters, simply because of what everything Dylan was just saying, which is if it can take the narrative off of Bakhmut and put it onto how weak and ineffectual the Russian government is, then that is a PR victory in the midst of a PR loss of the loss of Bakhmut.
Especially if the Russians paid such a high toll for Bakhmut too, right? What did the Ukrainians pay for this border crossing? Like a few American armored vehicles.
The Battle of Bakhmut lasted longer than the Battle of Stalingrad.
Almost double the time the Battle of Stalingrad was. And for a city of 70,000 people. 70,000.
Right.
But the Russians wanted to take a city of 3.5 million at the start of the war. It's dumbfounding how many people died for this, what is essentially rubble.
Okay, I want to get on this for a minute because there's part of this where we can talk about like the symbolism, but I don't really care about that too much. What I care about is like, hey, what's the actual strategic victory or losses here? Now, the Belgorod thing, it's a little annoying for the Russians to deal with, and I'm actually getting intel that the Russians are moving 2 regiments off the line to go reinforce that entire region. That's a good thing, maybe. The big thing about the Russians and the Ukrainians so far up until this point in the war is that they've treated the old Russo-Ukrainian border as kind of like a no-go zone. They haven't really crossed the borders in those particular areas since the offensives back around Kharkiv last August. So if we're going to re-expand the war, I don't know who this benefits, and that's a really big kicker here. The Russians tend to have more material and more manpower, but the Ukrainians have shown superior mobility. The issue is that everyone's been talking about where's the big offensive, because we didn't see one in the winter like we thought we would, and we haven't seen one so far in these quote unquote summer months. And for anyone who doesn't know,
pause. There was an offensive in the winter. There was a Russian offensive in the winter, and Bakhmut was the result of the winter offensive. It just
I'm talking about the Ukrainians.
Yeah, can we? I do want to acknowledge that, by the way, that there was an offensive for the entirety of the winter. And they took about 1/40th of the territory that the Ukrainians took, and about 1/3 of the time around Kharkiv, 1/3 of the time around Kherson. Like, the Russian strategy of grinding attritional warfare will only work if you think the Russians can keep up that pace of operations, assuming the Ukrainians don't heat up the pace of operations as well.
Right.
I'm going to be one of those people who says like Ukrainian victory is inevitable, because it's not. This war is still up in the air, and how this war ends is still up in the air. I'm a realist about the situation. I'm not going to eat all the copium or all the hopium and just assume the Ukrainians will win because they're the good guys or whatever. That's not how the world works.
I have a clarifying question really quick, if somebody doesn't mind. Does the current Russian...
And then you go ahead.
Sorry. Right.
So maybe I can give you some hopium, right? We know from the Izium offensives that they're in the Kharkiv offensives that the Ukrainians have seized a crap ton of Russian stuff. And while some of this is, garbage stuff, they've been able to do deferred maintenance. And I'm getting at least some good, knowledge here that they've got somewhere in the order of 10 mechanized brigades that have been fitted out since last August, since they started capturing all this. If they are able to move that in on offensive mobile warfare, the Russians are screwed. But this is the issue that I was just about to say right before you cut me off, is that the Rasputitsa, the Ukrainian-Russian mud season, never ended in the winter because it never froze, and it's still incredibly wet throughout most of Ukraine, even though it should be drying out right now. If that continues, yeah, we actually have a problem, because the Russians do favor that environment because they run their supplies through rail. But if the Ukrainians can use their mobile operations in the same way that they did for those last two offensives, I absolutely think they're going to smoke the floor with the Russians, because they can move and they can communicate and they can keep their logistics train active in that environment. But so far, the weather has not been conducive to that, which is a big problem.
Right.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. Yeah, thank you. I just wanted a clarifying point, and I legitimately don't know the answer to this, so I'm not saying one way or the other. Does the current Russian forces control more or less territory than what the separatist groups controlled at the start of the war?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
More.
I didn't understand the
Significantly.
question.
Technically, go ahead.
For you're talking about the breakaway areas that originally were started the war. Yeah, they control about 8 times what.
8 times as much. Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure I was following the correct information.
You still have the majority of Kherson Oblast that is still occupied, and that's basically everything south of the river. You have most of Zaporozhye that's still occupied, and the vast majority of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts are still under Russian control. They've significantly expanded their footprint here.
Just for another point of clarity, but since Russia has invaded, they've lost territory, correct?
Yeah, they've lost more than 50% of the territory they at some point held in the war.
Right.
Thank you.
That about covers that. So there was a highlighting question I wanted to ask that goes along with this, and it's should NATO countries...
Okay, so I'm going to be honest. The audio's so bad, I'm going to tap out for the third question. Is that possible? It's just everybody's roboto. Okay, I'm very sorry. I just there's only so much I can decode the messages that are coming through my computer.
Well,